The day they threw me out, the rain didn't stop. I remember the sound of it, relentless, cold, and mocking, as if the heavens themselves were laughing. My father stood by the window, silent, while my stepmother's words sliced through the air. "You stole from the company, Lena. You've embarrassed this family. I didn't steal anything." The documents she waved were forged, the numbers twisted, but in that moment, truth didn't matter, only appearances did. My brothers stood behind her, smirking. The people I grew up with, the ones who called me sister, no one defended me, not even my father. When the guards carried my suitcase out, I felt something break inside me, not my heart, but my faith. "You're no longer a part of this family," he said. "Don't come back." That night, drenched and alone, I whispered into the storm, "You've killed the daughter you knew. The woman who returns will be your reckoning." And just like that, Lena Williams died. London was colder than I imagined, not just in weather, but in the way people looked through you when you had nothing. I scrubbed floors, worked night shifts, and shared a tiny room with two strangers. Every time exhaustion pulled me down, I remembered my stepmother's smirk. I refused to be a victim. I read everything I could about business, leadership, and digital strategy. I took free online courses in between jobs, using borrowed Wi-Fi at coffee shops. Years blurred into lessons, pain became focus, shame became fuel. One night, while waiting tables, I met Mrs. Nora, a calm woman with eyes that saw too much. She owned a small consulting firm and recognized something in me. Hunger, perhaps. She hired me as an assistant. Within months, I was rewriting proposals, pitching clients, solving problems faster than the men in suits. Mrs. Nora once said, "Lena, one day they'll regret letting you go." Mark my words, I smiled faintly. "Oh, they will," I whispered, "but I won't stop at regret." By my 5th year in London, I was no longer the girl who begged for approval. I co-founded a consulting firm with Henry, a brilliant strategist I met through Mrs. Nora. Together, we built companies from the ground up, rescuing failing brands, restoring reputations, and mastering silent power. We named our firm Phoenix Global. It was fitting. After all, I had risen from ashes. Our reputation grew fast. Companies wanted our touch. Investors wanted our insight. And then, one ordinary Monday morning, an email came in from Williams Holdings Limited. My heart stopped. It was them. The same company that once threw me out was now drowning in losses. They needed help. They had no idea the person reading their plea was the woman they destroyed. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "Henry," I said, "I think it's time we take a very personal project." I didn't use my real name. They knew me as Miss Daniels, co-founder of Phoenix Global. My accent had softened, my face matured, and success had reshaped my confidence into armor. When I walked into the marble lobby of Williams Holdings, it smelled the same, power and pretension. My stepmother, Emily, greeted me with her rehearsed warmth. She didn't recognize me. Why would she? She'd buried me years ago. Their financial director presented chaos, debts, lawsuits, internal fraud. Ironically poetic, really. As I took notes, I said calmly, "We can restructure your leadership and recover your image, but we'll need full control of operations." Mr. Williams nodded eagerly. "Whatever it takes." If only he knew who was about to take everything. That night, as I left the building, I whispered to myself, Phase 1. Infiltration complete. Working with them felt like walking through a graveyard of memories. Every corner whispered betrayal. Every meeting tested my restraint. Emily was still manipulative, charming in public and cruel in private. My brothers were now directors, entitled, arrogant, and clueless. They mocked employees, forged deals, and lived off borrowed pride. But I had patience, the kind only pain can teach. I began gathering data quietly, internal emails, bank reports, secret audits. Everything they once accused me of, they were now guilty of. One evening, As I scrolled through the company archives, I found it. The old report that framed me. The falsified document signed by Emily herself. My hands trembled, but not from anger, from triumph. "You buried me with this," I whispered. "Now it will bury you." I planted myself in the meeting rooms like a quiet storm, observing the current that pushed the company toward ruin. People spoke loudly to cover fear. Paper smiles hid panic. My role allowed access to the executive calendar, the audit trails, the off-book transactions. I started small and surgical. A rephrased email here, a suggestion to clarify a contract clause there. Henry called it psychological pruning, making the rot visible by removing its camouflage. I watched Emily accept my suggestions with delight, never noticing the trap forming. I began nudging junior staff to speak up about anomalies. I made sure managers began to question the brothers' sudden investment schemes. Quietly, I routed an anonymous tip to a reputable external auditor we recommended, someone with courage and independence. The brothers scoffed, but they were too arrogant to see the snare. That night, Mr. Williams praised me in front of the table. Emily's eyes flashed with something unreadable. My heart didn't leap. It catalogued. When the auditors requested documents the next morning, a nervous hush fell over the boardroom. My stepbrothers, Lucas laughed nervously, while Leonard cursed under his breath. They thought it was a routine review. They didn't know who had called it in, and that was the first thread to unravel. The auditors moved like vultures, efficient, unromantic, precise. They asked for ledgers, approvals, and trail signatures. I watched as smiles wilted into constricted faces. My stepbrother's casual arrogance cracked when an off-book payment surfaced, a discreet transfer to a shell company linked to Leonard's consultant. Emily's composure blurred. She'd relied on cultivated calm, and now she fumbled through explanations that sounded like rehearsed theater. In the corridor, a junior accountant, the one I'd quietly mentored, said, "Thank you," and folded a report into my hand. Inside was evidence, accounts, timestamps, and a fingerprint of mismanagement. I could have exposed them then. I could have stormed the boardroom with proof and watched their collapse like a thunderclap. But revenge taught me sophistication. Spectacle was satisfying once, but ruin delivered slowly left scars. So I fed the auditors layers, small reveals that widened suspicion rather than destroying reputations outright. My stepbrothers began blaming each other in small, venomous ways. Emily orchestrated blame toward the finance team. Mr. Williams, confused and shaken, asked for a full internal review. That evening, as I walked past the family's framed portrait in the lobby, I pressed my palm to the glass. It felt cold, like the future I was carving. I lit the fuse. Now I watched the room tremble toward the explosion. Henry and I met in a cafe that smelled of burnt coffee and possibility. He suggested a plan that was half strategy, half payback. "We don't just fix the company," he whispered. "We restructure the empire, legally, publicly, and with absolute moral clarity." I nodded. He would plant PR narratives about transparency. I would push governance reforms, and together we'd coax investors to demand oversight. But he added something else. A confidant inside, a person with access and discretion. He had found a whistleblower in the finance department. Juliet, quiet, precise, and terrified. She'd watched payroll anomalies for years and needed protection. We gave her counsel, legal channels, and anonymity. Through Juliet, we funneled evidence to regulators and prepared a public-facing narrative of systemic mismanagement. My stepbrother's petty sins became institutional sins on paper. That week, Emily cornered me in the ladies' restroom and smiled too brightly. "You have done wonders," she said. "We might finally salvage the name." Her teeth shone. I tasted bile. I left the stall and sat for a long time on the bench, listening to my heartbeat. It beat with a patience that felt like the edge of a blade. When Juliet handed me a folder with a single sentence typed in bold, "Look behind the donations," my fingers froze. Donations. A charitable front. I hadn't expected that. And charity was the perfect mask. Philanthropy had always been their whitewashed halo. Gala dinners, check presentations, smiling photos for glossy magazines. But beneath the satin and applause were routed funds, favors with strings, and payoffs to secure political goodwill. The phrase, "look behind the donations," opened a door I hadn't known was locked. Juliet produced meeting minutes and invoices showing how charitable contributions were siphoned through offshore accounts before reappearing as personal loans. The auditors widened their scope. The PR team, sensing a leak, hurried to craft language about an internal probe, a phrase meant to soothe rather than threaten. I let them speak. It made the family look more fragile, not less. I arranged a controlled leak to a journalist friend who loved a scandal with evidence. The story that printed the next morning was careful, factual, and merciless in tone. The headlines asked questions the board could not answer overnight. At Williams Holdings, pandemonium became choreography. Emily's smile froze into a mask. Mr. Williams called an emergency family meeting that smelled like burned paper and desperation. When my stepbrothers stormed out of the boardroom, accusing each other like children, the company's stock took a sharp dip. Investors murmured, callers asked hard questions, the press smelled blood, and the Williams family, who had built their name on untouchability, shivered at the first cold breath of consequence. With the board in disarray, Mr. Williams turned to me with a vulnerability I'd never seen. His chin trembled like that of a weathered statue losing its base. He asked for options quietly in my office, away from cameras and the glare of the scandal. "We need someone who can salvage this," he said, voice cracked. "Will you help us?" I watched him carefully. The man who had once told me to leave was now begging for the thing he'd taken for granted: competence. Emily hovered behind him, the portrait of contrition. My stepbrothers stood at the edges like wounded lions sizing a carcass for final consumption. I could have refused. I could have handed the evidence publicly, reveling in their ruin. But my plan required more than humiliation. It required control. So I offered them a deal that sounded like salvation. Phoenix Global would oversee restructuring, but under terms that gave us operational control and transparency oversight. They protested, threatened legal action, and attempted to form alliances. Investors demanded governance reforms. They signed. Signing felt like holding the key to a prison I had never truly been allowed to enter. As I left the meeting that night, Mr. Williams' hand brushed mine in a grateful, awkward gesture. I didn't flinch. Underneath my composed exterior, a darker thought thrummed. The man who disowned me had just handed his house keys to the very person he once called not one of us. And yet, the best part of the plan was still waiting in the wings. Power doesn't announce itself. It hums quietly beneath the surface. Once the ink dried, I became the invisible hand steering their empire. Every decision passed through me, every approval required my signature. I reinstated ethical compliance reviews and hired teams loyal to Phoenix Global, in truth, loyal to me. My stepbrothers grumbled, but they needed the illusion of progress to appease shareholders. Emily tried to act civil, offering me coffee every morning like a peace treaty. I smiled, knowing each cup was a prop in her desperate performance. At night, I reviewed the company's deepest ledgers. Buried among numbers and forgotten subsidiaries, I found evidence of land deals linked to a tragic community displacement, a scandal that would destroy their name if made public. I archived it quietly. Not yet. Meanwhile, whispers filled the corridors. The new director has Williams' blood but no mercy. They were right on both counts. And when Mr. Williams called me daughter again during a board meeting, the word rolled off his tongue like an apology wrapped in pride. He had no idea how temporary his comfort was. Emily's mask began to crack first. She called me one night, her voice slurred, full of false courage, accusing me of engineering the chaos. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" she hissed. "You're enjoying this." I said nothing. Silence was sharper than words. By morning, rumors spread that Emily had taken a leave of absence. In truth, I'd quietly recommended her removal to stabilize investor confidence. Mr. Williams approved it instantly. I didn't need to raise my voice, just suggest what sounded reasonable. The brothers, stripped of her protection, turned on each other like dogs cornered in a shrinking yard. Lucas blamed Leonard for mismanaging procurement contracts. Lucas leaked Leonard's fake invoices to the press. The family name, once revered, became gossip fodder. When the family mansion appeared in a tabloid headline with the phrase "Empire in Decline," I poured myself a glass of wine and stared at the city lights. For the first time, I allowed myself a small smile. Vengeance, when precise, doesn't scream. It whispers. Mr. Williams fell ill that autumn, not fatally, but enough to remove him from the daily operations. He asked to see me privately. His study smelled of dust and memory. "I wronged you," he said, his voice trembling. "I was proud and blind. You were more family than any of them." For a moment, I almost faltered. The words I had yearned to hear came too late, like flowers laid on a grave after the rain. But I had promised myself no sentiment until justice was complete. I nodded respectfully. "Rest, sir." "I'll protect what's left of the name." He gripped my hand weakly, whispering, "You already are." As I left, Emily watched me from the corridor, her expression unreadable, a woman who could sense her kingdom slipping but couldn't grasp how or why. That night, Henry and I reviewed our final step, a merger that would absorb Williams Holdings entirely under Phoenix Global. Once executed, the family would lose controlling power. Their empire would still exist, but they'd be employees, not rulers. Revenge wasn't destruction anymore. It was elegant transfer. The merger day arrived like a quiet storm. Cameras flashed, journalists smiled, and words like strategic partnership and restructuring for sustainability echoed through the hall. My brothers, dressed in sharp suits, shook my hand through clenched teeth. Emily smiled for the cameras, but her fingers trembled when she signed the final page. In that moment, ownership passed. Phoenix Global became the parent company. I became the CEO. The press celebrated the move as a win for transparency. The staff erupted in cautious optimism. But in the family's mansion that night, silence filled the corridors where pride once lived. Henry raised a glass. "They kicked you out now. They are under your payroll." I didn't toast. I just whispered, "Cold justice." Later that week, Emily sent me an email. Short, fragile. "You've won." Was it worth it? I never replied. Because revenge, once complete, doesn't justify itself. It simply stands, silent, undeniable, inevitable. Months passed. The family worked quietly, stripped of power but still bound to the empire I rebuilt. Mr. Williams, recovering, called to thank me for saving the company. He never realized he was thanking me for his own dethronement. Emily resigned soon after, leaving behind an office that smelled faintly of her perfume and ambition. My brothers followed one after another, their reputations too fractured to repair. Their downfall wasn't a headline. It was a lifetime sentence of knowing they lost everything to the person they once discarded. As I stepped out into the cold London air, Henry called, asking, "What now?" I smiled softly. "Now, we build, from truth, not vengeance." The wind carried the city's hum around me. Justice had been served. Cold, clean, final. Victory didn't feel like celebration. It felt like silence, heavy, echoing, untrusting. Everywhere I went, people greeted me with awe or fear, sometimes both. The office I once entered as an outsider was now shaped by my every decision, yet I found no joy in the authority. Sometimes I saw the younger version of me, the girl who once stood outside the Williams gates in the rain, suitcase soaked, heart shattered, staring back from the mirrored glass. She looked at me, asking softly, "Was this enough?" Henry noticed my quiet withdrawal. "You won," he said one evening, watching the sunset glaze the city in gold. "But maybe that's not the same as peace." I wanted to argue, but he was right. Revenge gives you control, not comfort. That night, I opened my old journal, the one I had kept during my exile. Written across a page were 4 words in faded ink. "They'll need me someday." They did, and I came. But I wondered now, Had I become like them in the process? The tabloids eventually caught up. Journalists dug deeper into the Williams saga, uncovering the old donations scandal, the shell accounts, and the family's internal betrayals. This time, I didn't need to leak anything. Truth had grown its own legs. The media praised me as a visionary reformer. Commentators called me the woman who turned disgrace into legacy. But inside, I felt detached from the praise, like someone watching her own film from the back row. Then one morning, Emily called. Her voice was calm, almost haunting. "You were brilliant," she said. "You gave us what we deserved. But tell me, Lena, when the applause fades, who will you be?" The question lingered long after the call ended. That evening, Henry arrived with an envelope. Inside was a deed, my mother's old family land, lost years ago when the Williams destroyed our finances. He had quietly repurchased it under my name. "This is closure," he said. I cried for the first time in years, not from vengeance but from the slow release of everything vengeance had held prisoner. Mr. Williams asked to see me. His health had worsened. The empire he built now ran without his command. I found him sitting by a window, staring into nothing. He didn't speak at first, just breathed heavily, then said, "You've done what I never could. Build without corruption." I nodded. But his eyes, watery and remorseful, found mine. "I knew you were special, but my pride, it made me cruel." For the first time, I saw him not as the man who ruined my life, but as a relic of the arrogance I had already defeated. "I forgave you long ago," I said quietly. "You just never noticed." He smiled faintly. "Then you're free, Lena. Don't let victory chain you like guilt chained me." When he died 2 weeks later, the newspapers called him a fallen patriarch. I wrote his eulogy myself, simple, respectful, honest. There was no triumph in it, just truth. And maybe that was my real revenge, living above the bitterness that once defined me. Months turned into a year. The company flourished under transparency and innovation. Phoenix Global became a symbol of ethical leadership, a rebirth built on ashes. I began mentoring young women in business, those silenced, sidelined, underestimated. I taught them strategy, patience, and the power of grace wrapped around steel. The media called it the Lina Initiative. Emily lived quietly abroad now. One evening, I received a handwritten letter from her. It read, "You turned our cruelty into your crown. For that, I envy you. And strangely, thank you." I didn't reply. Some closures are best left unspoken. At an award gala months later, as I stood under the lights accepting a leadership honor, the host asked, "What drives your success?" I smiled and said, "Forgiveness, but not forgetfulness." The audience applauded. Only I knew how many ghosts stood applauding too. On the anniversary of the takeover, I returned to the old Williams estate. It was now a museum, an exhibition of the company's history and rebirth. Tour guides told the story like folklore. A family fell, a woman rose. In one corner hung the old family portrait, Mr. Williams, Emily, my stepbrothers, and a blank space where I'd once stood was cropped out. I stared at that gap for a long time, then took a pen from my bag and wrote on the frame's glass, "The missing one returned." A curator nearby smiled. "You must really admire her," he said, not recognizing me. I smiled faintly. "You have no idea." As I walked out into the sunlight, the wind carried the scent of new beginnings. For the first time, I wasn't the woman wronged or the woman avenged. I was simply free. Justice had been cold, but the peace that followed was warm. The quiet after victory is heavier than the battle itself. The boardroom no longer trembled with deceit, the hallways no longer echoed with whispers of betrayal, yet something lingered. Silence. The kind that forces you to hear every echo of your past decisions. I found myself revisiting old letters, old memories. My mother's words surfaced in my mind. "Power means nothing if it makes you forget your humanity." That night, I hosted a dinner for the company's staff. the same people who had once feared the Williams name. I stood before them and said, "This empire was reborn not by revenge, but by integrity." They applauded. Some cried, but as I looked across the crowd, I saw the faces of those who had watched me fall, then rise. Their respect wasn't for my success, it was for my restraint. That's when I realized the true measure of revenge isn't in destroying others, it's in becoming what they can never be. Henry and I walked through the old factory that once symbolized the family's pride. It was being rebuilt as a community innovation hub, my new project. "You've rewritten the story," he said, "from pain to purpose." I smiled faintly. Pain was always the teacher. I just finally listened. The press later called the project the House of Second Chances. It offered training and jobs to families once displaced by Willisms Holdings' corrupt land deals, the very scandal I had uncovered years ago. When the first batch of trainees arrived, I met a young girl named Aria. She told me her father had lost his land to a rich family's greed. I didn't tell her that family's name. I only said, "You'll build something greater." Watching her smile felt like redemption itself, quiet, pure, undeserved, but real. One evening, I received an invitation, a private family memorial organized by Emily. Against my better judgment, I went. It was small and quiet. My stepbrothers were there, thinner, humbler. No arrogance, no gold watches, no entourage, just people who had finally met the consequences of their choices. Emily approached me. Her eyes were tired but sincere. "You could have destroyed us completely," she said. "Why didn't you?" I looked at her and said softly, "Because I wanted you to live long enough to understand." Tears slipped down her cheeks. For the first time, she didn't look like an enemy, just a human being learning too late. As I left, my stepbrothers nodded respectfully. No words exchanged, none needed. They had lost everything that mattered, and yet, in that loss, perhaps found what they'd never valued: humility. Years later, at a global leadership conference in Geneva, I stood on stage to deliver a keynote address titled "Power, Betrayal, and Redemption." I began with a line that stilled the crowd. "I was once thrown out of a family for being too honest. Now I employ families to build honestly." The hall erupted in applause, cameras flashed, but behind every cheer, I saw flashes of the past: rain-soaked nights, closed gates, betrayal, and the long road back. After the speech, a young journalist asked, "If you could speak to the girl who was kicked out that night, what would you tell her?" I smiled. "I'd tell her the world will try to break you, but don't rush to prove them wrong. Just grow so much that they can't recognize the woman you become." The years have washed the anger from my voice, leaving only steel and serenity. Sometimes I walk through the company lobby and see portraits of all the founders, including Mr. Williams, framed beside the new generation of leaders. Below his portrait is a plaque that reads, "Legacy rebuilt through integrity." No one knows who wrote it, but I do. Emily now runs a small charity. My stepbrothers teach at business institutes, ironically lecturing about ethics. And me? I've stepped away from the boardroom, devoting my life to mentoring women in leadership. The revenge that began with fire ended with clarity. I didn't just win, I transformed the battlefield. As I close this chapter of my life, I think of that night years ago, standing in the rain, disowned and forgotten. If only they had known that the woman they cast out would someday own their empire. Justice wasn't loud, it was cold, and it was complete.
Do you think Lena wasn't had enough in serving her revenge? Do you think she should have done even worse? What do you think? Please let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share my videos. Thank you for watching.